I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. I was cleaning out the garage when I found it. An old suitcase, buried under years of clutter. Diane and I had moved into this house nearly a decade ago, and in that time, it's incredible how much junk piles up. I had no idea this old thing was still around, but there it was, a forgotten relic in a mountain of boxes. It seemed like it hadn't been touched in years, yet it was heavy, as if it held something that mattered. With a sigh, I knelt down, popped the latches, and opened it up. I expected maybe clothes or some old keepsakes, something innocuous. But instead, I found mementos from places I'd never heard Diane mention. Keychains from small towns, postcards with strange handwriting, a little Eiffel Tower figurine I'd never seen before, all of it from places she'd supposedly never been. My first instinct was that she'd picked them up for friends or colleagues, but even that didn't sit right. We'd been together for a decade, married for nearly as long, and she'd never mentioned anything about visiting these places. A shiver crawled down my spine. I felt a gnawing sensation, a whisper of doubt. Diane traveled a lot for work, I knew that. She worked in pharmaceuticals and was always jetting off to conferences. She'd bring back souvenirs sometimes, little things like fridge magnets or the occasional t-shirt. But these items, places like Orlando, a town I was sure she'd never set foot in, were the first clues that I'd somehow missed a deeper truth. The box's contents blurred in front of me as my mind reeled. I wished I could have confronted her right there, demanded to know why she had all these tokens from places she'd never mentioned. But something in me resisted the impulse, a heavy dread like I was standing at the edge of a cliff. I decided to wait. If Diane had a hidden life, then I would find out everything before saying a word. It wasn't about paranoia or suspicion. I needed clarity. I needed facts. That night, as Diane slept, I found myself wide awake, my mind a minefield of possibilities. When I'd kissed her goodnight, there'd been no hint of anything unusual, just the same warmth in her eyes that had been there since the day we met. But those mementos, those little scraps of memories hidden away, haunted me. With the house silent and the world outside dark, I felt like a thief in my own home as I went to her laptop. I knew her password, of course I did. 10 years together, you pick up on these things. At first, I found nothing suspicious, just the usual work emails, logistics, and back and forths about conference schedules. But then, a name caught my eye in her inbox, a Jeremy. At first, I thought it was just work-related, maybe a colleague she'd never mentioned. But as I scrolled back, the messages grew more personal. The formal greetings dissolved into, "Hey you," and, "Can't wait to see you." The emails told a story I hadn't been prepared for. I read about dinners in Orlando, whispered inside jokes, and lines laced with an intimacy I had only ever assumed was mine. My heart pounded as I read each line, trying to decipher the timeline. How long had this been going on? Was it still happening? The questions piled up, making it hard to breathe. When I finally tore myself away from the screen, it was dawn. Diane would be waking soon. I climbed back into bed, pretending to be asleep as she rose and got ready for work, my mind racing as she left the house, still blissfully unaware of the storm I had just stumbled into. It wasn't until she was out the door that I sat up, the sheets twisted around me, my mind still reeling from the shock. This wasn't just a passing fling. This was something deeper, something that spanned years. Days passed in a haze. I was caught between the mundane tasks of everyday life and the sudden, horrific knowledge that my wife was cheating on me. I didn't confront her. I couldn't. Not yet. The betrayal ran too deep, and I needed to understand why it had happened, what had gone wrong, and how I had missed it. Instead, I began gathering evidence, piecing together a puzzle I hadn't even realized was scattered. I checked our phone records, scrolling through lists of numbers until I found one that appeared over and over, a number with an Orlando area code. Just seeing it there made my heart sink. She'd lied to me so many times, weaving her deception right under my nose. It was like I'd been living in a shadow of the life I thought we had. I followed her carefully, watching her every move. When she said she was going to work, I'd make excuses to drive by her office to see if she was there. She always was. But when she went on her so-called business trips, I'd find myself wondering where she really was. She never gave me any reason to question her, never a single slip. Diane had covered her tracks with a skill that was both maddening and impressive. Finally, I hired a private investigator, someone to confirm the suspicions that now felt like poison in my veins. They sent me photos, a smiling Diane and Jeremy, arm in arm, stepping out of a restaurant in Orlando, just like she'd mentioned in her emails. She looked carefree, her eyes bright and happy in a way I hadn't seen in years. She didn't look like my Diane at all. Or maybe this was who she'd always been, and I had just been too blind to see it. When I got the photos, something inside me snapped. It was like my entire world had been a mirage, one I could finally see through. I felt betrayed in a way I couldn't put into words. This was more than just an affair. She had been living a double life, and her lies stretched across years, tearing down everything I thought we'd built together. But I didn't confront her immediately. Instead, I planned. If Diane thought she could get away with this, she was wrong. I spent my nights replaying every conversation we'd ever had, looking for clues, for signs I'd missed. It was like picking at a wound that never healed, each memory tinged with the bitterness of betrayal. I decided I would wait for the right moment, a time when she couldn't hide, couldn't lie. I wasn't going to let her rewrite the story or make me doubt my own version of events. I wanted the truth out in the open, and I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices. As I prepared myself for the confrontation, I realized that this wasn't just about revenge. This was about reclaiming my life from the wreckage she'd made of it. Diane was always meticulous, careful in a way that had probably kept her secret safe for so long. But now that I knew, every little thing she did seemed to scream of deception. Each time she smiled at me or kissed me goodbye, it felt hollow, an empty gesture to keep up appearances. Her affection, her warmth, it all felt staged, like I was watching a performance she'd rehearsed 100 times before. The investigator's photos haunted me, burned into my mind. Diane with that same smile, the one I'd thought was mine alone, laughing with someone else. Jeremy wasn't just a name on a screen anymore, he was a face, a presence in my life that I hadn't realized was looming over me. The worst part was how happy she looked, how natural it all seemed. She was carefree, the woman I remembered from years ago, long before she'd started drifting away. I needed more, though. The investigator's photos and phone records were devastating, but I wanted to understand how this could have happened under my nose. I'd been so blind, so trusting. Every detail of our life together felt tainted now, but I still couldn't bring myself to confront her directly. It was too soon. I needed to build a case, not just to confront her, but to remind myself that this wasn't a nightmare I'd wake up from. It was real, and I was going to have to deal with it. So I became my own investigator, shadowing my wife in my own home. I watched her every move, tuned into every word she said, looking for cracks in her perfect facade. The odd part was, once I knew her secret, I could see the little details unraveling around her. She'd gotten comfortable, maybe even sloppy, thinking I'd never look too deeply. She had no idea I'd already seen through it all. She left her phone on the counter one night, and while she showered, I looked through it, scrolling back through messages that started out as harmless chats. But once again, Jeremy's name popped up, a constant thread of texts, images, little jokes that, to her, probably felt innocent. But to me, they were daggers. That night, I lay in bed beside her, feeling the weight of every lie she'd told me. Diane turned to me, murmuring a soft goodnight as if nothing was wrong. She looked peaceful, her face relaxed, and for a moment, I almost missed the woman I thought I knew. But the next moment, the betrayal hit me all over again, like a wound that refused to heal. I needed an outlet, a way to get rid of this pent-up rage, this sense of loss that had taken over every part of my life. And that's when I decided I would make her understand what she had done. In the days that followed, I started organizing everything I'd collected. Each photo, each text, each scrap of evidence was a piece of my anger, a fragment of the betrayal I needed her to see. I knew exactly where to leave it, her desk at work, the one place she would least expect me to make my move. She was in control of her life there, the respected professional, the person she wanted everyone to think she was. But I was going to bring her lies out of the shadows. I printed out the photos from the investigator, each one of them more damning than the last. Her smiling face, her hand wrapped around Jeremy's arm, the two of them looking like they didn't have a care in the world. I knew the images would sting her, especially in the context of her professional world. I wanted her colleagues to see her not as the polished professional she pretended to be, but as the woman who had lied and betrayed her husband and family. It was a way to strip her of the control she'd held over me for so long. The morning I decided to act, Diane went off to work like any other day. She kissed me goodbye at the door, completely unaware that I knew every detail of her deception. As soon as she left, I packed up the evidence and drove to her office. The building was quiet in the early hours, and with her coworkers bustling around the floor, no one thought twice about me being there. They all assumed I was just another client, waiting for a meeting or passing through. I walked over to her desk, heart pounding, but my mind was clear. I wasn't the husband begging for explanations or clinging to a love that no longer existed. I was a man who was ready to take back the life that had been stolen from him, one lie at a time. I placed the folder on her desk, each piece of evidence meticulously organized. It was clinical, almost like I was putting together a work presentation, facts, proof, undeniable truth. And as I stood there, knowing she would come in and see it all, I felt the smallest hint of peace. But that peace was fleeting. As I left her office, the anger returned, sharper than before. She was about to see everything, every painful truth laid out in front of her. I didn't stick around to see her reaction. It didn't matter. The truth was no longer something she could hide from me, and soon, she wouldn't be able to hide it from anyone else either. That evening, Diane came home in a state of shock. She was pale, her eyes wide, as if she'd seen a ghost. She didn't say anything as she set her bag down and looked at me. I waited, letting the silence speak for itself. She didn't try to deny it, didn't make any excuses. She just stared at me, the reality of what she had done finally sinking in. "How long did you know?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer her. There was no point. She'd known the answer for a long time, maybe even longer than I had. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of everything we'd lost. For the first time in months, I saw her facade crack, the mask slipping as she realized there was nothing left to hide behind. After a while, she sat down on the couch, her hands trembling. I watched her, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The woman I had loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who had lied and betrayed me. But as I looked at her, I realized that I didn't want explanations, or apologies. I just wanted to be free of the pain she had caused. Eventually, Diane tried to speak, but her words were hollow, the excuses empty. She talked about feeling neglected, about needing excitement, but none of it mattered. The damage was done, and there was no going back. I told her I wanted a divorce, that there was nothing left to discuss. She looked at me, tears in her eyes, pleading for forgiveness. But I'd already moved on, in my mind at least. I'd let her go the moment I saw those photos, the moment I realized that everything I thought we had was a lie. As she cried, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The anger, the betrayal, the pain, it was all still there, but I no longer needed it to define me. I had taken my life back, and as I walked out the door that night, I left her and all her lies behind. I didn't look back as I walked out of the house, but every step away felt heavier than the last. My hands shook as I got in the car, the reality of everything pressing down on me with relentless weight. I hadn't left Diane before. Not really. Every argument, every minor fracture over the years, we always found a way back to each other. But this time was different. There was no coming back from this. I had watched her lie, witnessed her plead, and now I had finally, painfully let go. I spent that night at a cheap hotel, one of those places where the wallpaper is peeling, and the air smells faintly of dust and mildew. But it was quiet, and that was all I needed. Just a place to breathe, away from the lies, away from the memories that clung to every corner of our home. I lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile this new reality. It felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. The betrayal was a bruise that wouldn't fade, one that ached with every passing moment. By morning, the numbness had set in, a cold emptiness where the pain had been. I knew I couldn't just linger in that hotel room forever. There were still things that needed to be done. Loose ends to tie up, even if they felt like they were strangling me. I checked out of the hotel and drove back home, not entirely sure what I'd find there. Part of me expected Diane to be gone, maybe a hastily written note on the counter, saying she couldn't bear to face me again. But when I opened the door, there she was, sitting at the kitchen table, her face drawn and tired, as though she hadn't slept either. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes pleading. "James," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, can we talk?" I didn't answer right away, just set down my keys and took a deep breath. I'd played out this conversation in my head 100 times, but now, standing here, I wasn't sure what I even wanted to say. Part of me wanted to lash out, to demand answers that could somehow explain away the mess of lies she had woven. But deep down, I knew no answer would ever be enough. Her betrayal was something I would never understand, no matter how hard I tried. "What is there to talk about, Diane?" My voice sounded distant, hollow, even to my own ears. "You made your choice. You lied. For years. There's nothing left to say." She swallowed, her eyes filling with tears as she tried to hold herself together. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you more than I can ever make up for. But," she looked down, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her wedding ring, twisting it around her finger. "I thought maybe we could try to fix this. I thought, maybe we could find a way to move forward." I almost laughed, the absurdity of her words hanging in the air. Fix this. As if there was some magic cure, some way to erase the years she had spent with another man. As if there was any way to repair the shattered trust, the love she had taken and twisted into something I barely recognized. But I didn't laugh. Instead, I just looked at her, my heart heavy with the weight of everything we had lost. "There's no going back, Diane," I said quietly. "You destroyed that chance the moment you chose to be with him. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed everything we built together." She wiped at her tears, her face pale and raw with regret. "I know. God, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I can't let go, James. I can't just walk away. Please, just give me a chance to make it right." I shook my head, the finality of it settling over me like a cold wave. "There's nothing you can do, Diane. Nothing you say will ever change what happened. You took a part of me, a part of us, and threw it away for him. I can't forget that." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw her hope break, saw the reality dawn on her face. She had been holding on to the idea that maybe, somehow, I'd be the one to forgive, to find a way to accept the unthinkable. But there was nothing left to accept. The life we'd shared was gone, replaced by a hollow shell I could no longer fill. "I'll leave," I said, my voice soft, almost gentle. "I'll pack some things and give you space to sort out whatever it is you need to figure out. But I'm done, Diane. Us, it's over." She tried to argue, her words spilling out in a desperate, incoherent stream, but I turned and walked upstairs, blocking out the sound of her voice. In our bedroom, I grabbed a suitcase, throwing in clothes and essentials, things I'd need while I figured out what came next. As I packed, memories flooded back, moments of laughter and quiet nights, the life I'd thought was real. But they felt like shadows now, reminders of a love that had been twisted into something else. When I came back downstairs, Diane was standing by the door, her face streaked with tears. She didn't say anything, just watched as I lifted my suitcase and headed toward the door. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of something close to pity. She looked so lost, so broken. But then I remembered the lies, the deceit, the years she'd spent hiding her affair. And whatever sympathy I might have felt vanished. I walked out the door, not looking back. Over the next few days, I tried to settle into a routine. I stayed with a friend, Jack, who knew bits and pieces of what had happened. He was sympathetic, gave me space when I needed it and offered the occasional word of advice when I was ready to hear it. But mostly, I kept to myself, navigating the mess Diane had left behind. I went to see a lawyer, started working through the logistics of the divorce. Every meeting, every document I signed felt like a reminder of how much I had lost. I was dismantling a life I'd spent years building, taking apart every detail, every promise, every memory. It was painful, yes, but there was a sense of relief in it, too. Like I was finally freeing myself from the weight of Diane's betrayal. One afternoon, as I was packing up my things at Jack's place, my phone buzzed. A message from Diane. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the screen, torn between the impulse to delete it without reading and the need to hear her last words. Against my better judgment, I opened it. "I'm sorry, James. I know that doesn't change anything, but I need you to know. I need you to understand that, despite everything, I loved you. I still love you." I stared at the message, a bitter laugh escaping me. Love? How could she use that word after everything she'd done? Love was trust, commitment, a promise to stand by each other even when things got hard. What she had done wasn't love, it was selfishness, a betrayal that ran so deep, it left scars I knew would never fade. But in a strange way, reading her message brought me closure. I no longer felt the urge to demand answers, to drag out a conversation that would only reopen old wounds. She could keep her love, her apologies, her regrets. They meant nothing to me now. The next day, I finalized the papers, signing away a decade of my life in a few swift strokes of a pen. The lawyer looked at me, offering a sympathetic smile as she handed me the final document. "It's done," she said softly. "You're free." Free. The word hung in the air, unfamiliar and bittersweet. I nodded, feeling the weight of it settle over me, a mixture of relief and loss that cut deeper than I'd expected. But as I walked out of the lawyer's office, a strange calm washed over me. I was free, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe again. The marriage I had once cherished was gone, buried under the lies Diane had left behind. But as I walked out into the bright afternoon, I felt something else, a sense of possibility, a glimmer of hope. There was a future out there, one where I could start fresh, free from the shadows of her betrayal. And as I took that first step forward, I knew I was ready to face it, to rebuild a life that was truly mine. The next few weeks passed quietly, almost eerily so. I'd thrown myself into work, determined to rebuild my life one step at a time. Diane was gone, the divorce finalized, and while there were moments when memories crept back to haunt me, I pushed forward. I was finding my footing again, creating a new normal. Friends started inviting me out, and slowly, the hollow ache of betrayal began to fade. Or at least, I thought it was fading. Then one evening, just as I was closing up my office, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, debating whether to let it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. "James," a woman's voice asked, slightly breathless. "It's Sonia." Sonia. The name jolted me. I hadn't spoken to Diane's daughter since the divorce, and I'd assumed she was as done with me as I was with her mother. But hearing her voice, full of an urgency I hadn't expected, I knew something was wrong. "Sonia," I replied, trying to mask my surprise. "What's going on?" She hesitated, her voice shaking. "James, I need to talk to you, in person. It's about my mom." A wave of irritation surged through me. I'd gone through hell because of Diane, the last thing I wanted was to get dragged back into her orbit. But Sonia sounded distressed, genuinely so, and I couldn't ignore that. "Fine," I said reluctantly. "Where are you?" Within the hour, I found myself sitting across from her in a small coffee shop. Sonia looked exhausted, her eyes red and shadowed, as if she hadn't slept in days. She was fidgeting, twisting a napkin in her hands, and I realized she was nervous, something I hadn't seen in her before. "Thanks for meeting me," she murmured, looking down. "Of course," I replied, softer than I'd intended. "What's going on?" She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting mine, filled with a weight I hadn't expected. "I know this is going to sound strange, and you might not believe me, but my mom didn't cheat on you. At least, not the way you think." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process her words. "Sonia, I'm not sure what you're trying to say. I saw the emails, the photos. It's over. There's nothing left to discuss." She shook her head, her hands trembling as she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "I found this after you two split up. I thought you needed to see it." Confused, I took the notebook from her, flipping through the pages. It was Diane's handwriting, page after page of entries, each one dated. I scanned the first entry and froze. August 12th. "Another meeting with Dr. Hansen. He said the treatments are working, but I don't feel any different. How do I keep this from James? I can't stand the thought of him watching me fade away." My hands tightened around the notebook as I read on, my pulse pounding in my ears. Each entry told a story I hadn't known: doctor's appointments, treatments, medications. Diane had been sick. Very sick. And she'd kept it from me. I looked up at Sonia, who was watching me with a mixture of sympathy and sadness. "She found out a little over 2 years ago," Sonia whispered. "She didn't want you to know. She thought if you knew, you'd spend all your time taking care of her instead of living your life. So she created the affair. She thought you'd hate her, leave her, and move on with your life. She was just trying to protect you." The room felt like it was spinning, the weight of her words crushing down on me. All this time, I'd believed she had betrayed me. I'd spent months hating her, despising her for the lies. And yet, every lie had been meant to save me. To set me free from a burden she'd decided I didn't deserve to bear. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, as the reality of her sacrifice sank in. Diane had orchestrated every detail, every carefully planted hint, to make me believe she was cheating. And I had fallen for it. I had walked away just as she'd planned, leaving her to face her illness alone. Why didn't she just tell me? I whispered, my voice breaking. Why didn't she trust me enough to be there for her? Sonia's face softened, her hand reaching out to touch mine. "She thought you'd never move on, James. She wanted you to have a life, a real one, without the pain of watching her waste away." The devastation hit me like a tidal wave, drowning me in guilt and grief. Diane had loved me enough to let me hate her, to let me believe the worst, just so I could have a future without her. All those angry words, all the pain and betrayal, it had all been a lie, a story she'd woven to protect me from the truth. What happened to her? I managed to ask, the words catching in my throat. "She passed away last week," Sonia whispered, her voice choked. "She didn't want anyone to know. She didn't want you to know." I felt my heart shatter all over again, the ache now deeper and rawer than any betrayal. Diane had been gone for days, and I hadn't even known. She'd left this world believing I hated her, that her plan had worked perfectly. And I would never get the chance to tell her the truth, that I would have stayed, that I would have loved her through every moment, every battle, every heartbreak. I closed the notebook, my hands shaking as I set it down. The tears came, silent and relentless, blurring my vision as I sat there, the weight of Diane's final gift settling over me. Sonia reached out, her hand resting on mine as we sat in silence, the shared grief binding us in a way I hadn't expected. Diane was gone, and with her, the life I'd thought we'd lost. But in her own way, she had given me something, a second chance at life, a future free from the pain she had borne alone. As I sat there, I realized that her love had been greater, more selfless than I'd ever understood. Diane had given me a gift I could never repay, a sacrifice I would carry with me for the rest of my days.